Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's Monday evening, actually. It's September 1st, it's Labor Day in the United States. Just in case any of you don't know this, um, the original Labor Day was actually May 1st, otherwise known as May Day, and it was like International Workers' Day. And it was founded, I believe, in the United States in response to I think it was like the Haymarket Massacre, where there was a rebellion of workers against working conditions, oppressive working conditions. And there was a massacre, a bomb was thrown, people were summarily executed because they supposedly caused that bombing, but it probably wasn't true. It was the usual story of the police framing somebody and then killing him to get rid of him because he was raising uncomfortable questions. But in any case, the powers that be in the United States wanted to bury the whole idea of May Day, Workers' Day, so they changed it to Labor Day, September 1st, as a way to distract people, which is a constant hobby of the elites running the United States. They're always distracting you from the reality and taking your attention, putting it somewhere else. But that's another whole other story. So what I want to talk about today was I guess you could say, motivated by two aspects. One is just the ongoing horrific slaughter going on and oppression of the Israelis against the Palestinian population, which I've understood, was a problem going back years and years, actually. But it's really reached the point where it's an international crime of just monstrous proportions. So I thought I would raise the whole topic of Jewishness and anti-Semitism and all those kinds of questions. So I'm going to be somewhat, in a way, kind of autobiographical, but also historical, analytical. So first of all, I was raised. There's in the original Judaism was practiced was called Orthodox Judaism, and these are the super religious Jews. And there's different even sects within Orthodox Judaism, but I guess you could say, I think it was probably like in the mid-19th century, as the power of these rabbis was diminished because of the whole general, you could say, liberalization of thought in Europe that was taking place in the going from the 1700s, 1800s. During that time, you had a French Revolution, an American Revolution. And then in the 1800s, you had the Revolution of 1848. You had Napoleon, who was trying to, he was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he's a militarist, and on the other hand, he was trying to promote some sort of liberalism, liberal ideas. I won't go into the history of that, but I'll mention a book that's been written. It was written in 1994 by somebody named Israel Shahak, called Jewish Religion, Jewish History, The Weight of 3,000 Years. And that's a very informative book, which I encourage you to read, and I'll put the link to it in the description. But in any case, so you had the kind of classic Orthodox Judaism, which was there were lots of very strict rules, basically, about what you were supposed to think and what you're supposed to do in every aspect of your life. And for example, you're not supposed to eat milk with meat. I used to, as a young person, I thought, well, why do they say I can't eat milk with chicken? Because chickens don't give milk to their chicks, but they said you can't eat milk with chicken. So I just thought some of these rules really don't make sense to me. But anyway, so I was always kind of like that. But Reform Judaism was a lot more liberal in its thinking, a lot more open, you could say, to new ideas, and they were trying to basically adapt Jewish thinking and identity towards the modern world. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that when I was, I think it was 8 years old, my father had died when I was 8 years old, and my mother, in order to make some extra money, she was a school teacher. So, but during the summer, she had a job as the director of a girls section of a Jewish summer camp. There were a lot of Jewish summer camps, apparently all throughout the Northeast. I know in New York State and in New Hampshire and different places. And I went to a camp called Camp Tevya. Now, Tevya, you may, for those of you who kind of know about these things, there was a character called Tevya the Tailor in a musical called Fiddler on the Roof, which I think kind of has a little bit of a Zen quality to it, because you're on the peak of this roof. You could go either way, so there's this kind of paradoxical aspect to it, and I think there's some sort of aspect of Judaism that may have influenced my thinking on some kind of deep subconscious level regarding Zen. But in any case, this is a Zionist summer camp. We sang Israeli folk songs. The food was kosher. This is where the rich kids went, to summer camp, and you went there not for a week or something. You went there for 8 weeks. So the kids who went to this camp were quite wealthy, and my mother was, she was not wealthy. She was working class. She was a teacher. She's making, she was wondering, if I teach in Brookline, Massachusetts, I can make $3,300, and if I teach in Arlington, which is another suburb of Boston, I can make $3,500. So now, of course, that was in the 1950s and 1960s. So that was more money than it seems like, but it was still not a huge amount of money. But in any case, so there I was at Camp Tevya, and we learned all the Israeli folk songs, and but we had holidays, and Shabbat Shalom Umavarach. There's a song when it was Friday evening. It was bringing in the Jewish Sabbath, so we sing these songs, and the food was always very good, and we sang Israeli folk songs, and they taught us Israeli dancing and all this stuff. So I always kind of surprise Israelis when I meet them, and I start singing Israeli folk songs. They say, "Who is this guy from America singing Israeli folk songs?" Anyway, so I was raised. So that was a large part of my childhood experience. But of course, underneath that was there were two things going on. One was the memory of the Holocaust, which had taken place, just a little over 20 years earlier, and which was clearly even though we were in the United States, and we didn't experience the Holocaust directly. I know that my grandmother, she had come to the United States in the early 1900s, I believe, and but most of her family lived in Lithuania, which was part of the Russian Empire. And when the Nazis came into Lithuania after the outbreak of World War II, her sister and a cousin escaped across the Soviet Union and landed in Palestine, where they were saved from being killed. My grandmother told me that the rest of her family had been killed by Hitler. So I've always had this kind of innate, fear of fascism and this kind of, gross anti-Semitism coming back. The other influence that I had at that time was there was a movie and a novel called Exodus, which was basically a propagandistic version of the settling of Israel, and a very, very favorable view of Zionism, and a very not a favorable view of the Arab and Palestinian peoples who were living in Palestine. And then the Jews came in, of course, and kind of it's the rest is history. We know that Israel was created in 1948. There was a lot of struggle. There was terrorism. There were Jewish terrorist groups that were terrorizing not just the British, who had the mandate for governing Palestine after World War I from 1917, I guess it was. But the Jewish community wanted to have its own state, and there were actual terrorist groups operating there. There was a major terrorist attack on the King David Hotel, where some Jews dressed as Arabs brought in some milk containers, but they were loaded with explosives. The explosives blew up, major damage to the hotel. 90 people died, and the Jewish terrorists also killed one of the mediators, Count Folk Bernadotte. So it was a very, very volatile time, very violent time. And in the novel and in the movie, there's a I guess you could say a vignette where the Palestinians, raped the hero's girlfriend, and of course the Israelis were killing Palestinians. So there was this kind of narrative going on, and it created a very strong pro-Zionist attitude among Americans at that time, and certainly among Jews. However, what I didn't know at that time was that there was a significant portion of the Jewish community that did not believe in Zionism. And in 1948 specifically, Albert Einstein, probably the most prominent Jewish intellectual and physicist of the 20th century, wrote a letter to the New York Times, co-authored by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was the Holocaust researcher who wrote The Banality of Evil, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Eichmann and Jerusalem. So she was a real scholar of the Holocaust. And there were other prominent Jewish intellectuals. They wrote this letter saying that the new leadership of the Israeli state, notably people like Menachem Begin, were heading what were terrorist groups, and that they had elements of fascism and Nazism, and if they got control of the Jewish state, there'd be nothing but trouble. And of course, they wrote that in December 1948, and they were absolutely right. So this is kind of some of the background of my my thinking about Judaism and Zionism and so on. So while I was at this Jewish summer camp, there was a particular holiday called Tish B'Av, which means the 9th day of the lunar month of Av in the Jewish calendar. And this is you could say the Jewish Memorial Day, or it's a day of mourning for the many times that Jews have been persecuted throughout history, according to Jewish historiography. And at the time, I had this inkling that, the Native Americans, they were exterminated, and there have been other Holocausts where other peoples have been exterminated, wiped out. So is there something really special about the Jewish people that sets Jews apart and gives them special privileges? I thought there was something strange about that. I didn't really accept it. Now, there was another aspect to this, which is that in the summer camp, you could tell that there was this kind of feeling of isolation of the Jewish community, where there was a feeling of both we're inherently superior to other people. We talked about the goyim. The goyim are the non-Jews, the Gentiles. So there was a kind of a subtle, or maybe in my milieu of people, it was subtle. But I think in other parts of the Jewish community, it was probably not so subtle. I think there was probably some actual real antipathy towards towards non-Jews. So I call that, I say, is the problem anti-Semitism or is the problem anti-goyimism? Well, certainly there's been problem on both sides, because there certainly has been there have been non-Jews who didn't like the Jews, and the Jews also didn't like the non-Jews. And I'm thinking, why can't we just get along? Well, it turns out that there have been periods of history where Jews and non-Jews have gotten along. In fact, in Palestine, following the Roman Empire's control of Palestine, there were Christians there, there were Jews there, and then of course as Islam arose, Islam became a major force within Palestine. It wasn't like it was completely smooth sailing, but there wasn't like really, really bad persecution. And so there's been different flavors of relationships between the Jewish community and other communities in countries where they've lived. Because, of course, through most of Jewish history, following Israel being taken over by the Roman Empire, and eventually many of them being expelled for rebelling against the Roman Empire. They've been in many different countries, and there's been major ups and downs where in some cases they were treated extremely poorly and expelled, and in other cases, as Shahak points out in his novel, not a novel, in his history, that the Jews were often employed by the higher ups, the royalty, to carry out the orders against the peasants and the serfs and people like that. Then we're talking about, it was almost like a caste-like society where you had, the super wealthy owners of the country who made all the rules and had all the privileges, and then you had people at the bottom who were the serfs and the peasants who were living in extreme poverty. And according to Shahak, often the Jews were used as a kind of intermediary to carry out the work that the rules that were implemented by the nobility. And as a result, when there were rebellions, they often rebelled against the people who were carrying out the orders. And so the Jews, thought, oh, they're anti-Semitic. Well, it was not so much an anti-Semitic issue; it was a class issue, where you have, the bottom of the les miserables, the people who were in the lowest stratum, hated both the kings and queens, as well as the people who carried out the orders of the kings and queens, which were often carried out by Jews. So this is an important part of the whole dynamic of anti-Semitism. Shahak talks also about the totalitarian nature of classical Judaism. And when I was, as I mentioned, I went to a Reformed Jewish synagogue. And most Jewish synagogues, you had to wear a head covering called a yarmulke. But my synagogue was super liberal, and you didn't even have to wear a yarmulke. Now, down the street from my synagogue, Temple Sinai, was another temple called Temple Shalom. Shalom means peace. It's like as if, when Israelis greet each other, they say shalom. I say, oh my God, you've got to be kidding. Talk about doublethink. But anyway, so they went to Temple Shalom, which was more of a it was more conservative. It wasn't quite as liberal as Temple Sinai was. But we did study we studied people like Maimonides, who was considered this great, Jewish philosopher, and we read things like the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, which means the set table, and we'd read things like, if you fart, you're supposed to walk back and forth 4 times. There are a lot of really, to my mind and to my liberal Jewish friends' minds, probably a lot of stupid stuff. But to be a religious Jew, you're supposed to follow these rules, and so I just thought, I really don't know about this. So at one point, I was 16 years old, and so I got bar mitzvahed, at the age of 13, and then, but after bar mitzvah, you're supposed to be now. This is saying now today I am a fountain pen, because when you got bar mitzvahed, one of the gifts you were given was a very, very, like a gold fountain pen or something like that. But it kind of signified a young Jewish man's entry into manhood, so to speak. Although what I've recently learned that was a fairly recent custom that's been brought about, but setting that aside. But at one point, my rabbi, was talking about God. So I said, well, what is God? And he said, well, God is like the king of the universe. He's the creator of the universe. And I thought, no, I don't really think so. He says, well, God is like a personal God. It's like somebody that you can talk to. And I thought, no, I don't really think that's right. He says, well, it's kind of like nature and the universe and things like that. And so this is a kind of idea of pantheism. And pantheism was advocated by a Jewish philosopher, I think a Dutch philosopher named Spinoza. And so he had a more, what can I say, maybe a more cosmic view, or more mystical or something view of the universe, what I would call a quantum view of the universe. And it was more compatible with my thinking that there's no like entity up there that's giving all the. I mean, it's like, if God created the universe, who created God? Where did God come from? So none of that made any sense to me. And when I was 16, I just said to the rabbi, thanks a lot. It's been nice knowing you, but I'm not really interested. So, but at that time, I had read my first book. Let's see, when I was 14, I read my first book about Zen, called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. And I thought, these people are really onto something, because they're talking about real freedom, real mental freedom, where they're willing to go against the grain, going against authority, and not believing everything that everybody else tells you is true or not. You got to find out for yourself. So that was my attitude, from I guess maybe from the time I was like 13 years old and I read Albert Einstein's biography. I realized this guy, I really liked what Einstein had to say, because he had his vision of the universe and how things worked. And also he was a very humane person. I didn't realize it at the time, but he advocated socialism, basically saying that the whole, capitalist method of running a society was causing lots of trouble, and which I also agreed with. But what's kind of interesting is that my grandmother, I think my grandmother, as I mentioned earlier, grew up in Lithuania, and she came to the United States. And I think she came probably after the failed 1905 revolution. I'm guessing that based on her age and what was going on at the time and so on. And so we never really talked politics. My family was, they were good liberal Democrats. They were like what Franklin Delano Roosevelt Democrats, and quasi-socialists like Henry Wallace. I think they would have supported his policies. But my grandmother, I'm pretty sure that she had to leave Europe because of at that time it was very volatile. There was a revolution that went on. It did fail, and her father basically said, "You got to get out of here," and he sent her to America. So I have a feeling that somewhere buried in my DNA is that kind of revolutionary nature. There's no way to verify it really, but I just kind of have a feeling about that. And when I talked with my grandmother at one point, she kind of acknowledged my sort of rebellious nature, and I could tell she kind of approved of it. So So then I go to the university, and I'm reading. I was majoring in chemistry, and the Vietnam War is going on, and I'm just thinking, this is better living through chemistry. We got napalm, we've got Agent Orange, we got tear gas. These are all products of better living through chemistry. I just thought, I'm not going to do this, and I thought, what is going on? Why is the world so messed up? And in my own life, I felt like there was this kind of undercurrent of trauma in my own family, which I didn't really understand, but a sense of anxiety that I didn't really understand what was going on, and I felt like I really needed to come to grips with it. So after I finished university, I absolutely did not want to get a job. I wrote a letter to my cousin, and I said, we're living in a dog-eat-dog world, and I don't want to eat the flesh of dogs. And I was probably headed for, a very hard life because of my unwillingness to go along with all that. So I left Boston, and on the advice of a woman, a beautiful woman that I'd met in college, who had been to the first Zen monastery. She said, if you're interested in Zen, you've got to go to California because they're practicing Zen there. So I went to the Zen Center, and sure enough, I hung out with there. I held down a couple of menial jobs and got fired from all of them. I went to an employment agency, and they said, we're going to take this test to see what your aptitude is, and they said, you're very intelligent, but you're too negative, so we're not even going to try and find you a job. At one point, I went to another employer. I found an ad, and I think it was for Beneficial Financer. I think it was something like that. It was one of these finance companies. So I go there, and I had a suit. I had shaved off my beard because I looked like Karl Marx. I have bushy brown hair and a beard, and I could have passed for a young Karl Marx, who, by the way, was Jewish. During the 1800s, there was a whole kind of rebellion against this extreme control of the Jewish community by the rabbinical community. So it was a great kind of flowering of Jewish thought, and when the Jewish community was kind of released from that intellectual and spiritual oppression, it was able to, they used instead of studying just the Torah and this is, like this, they're studying, let's study physics, let's study music, let's study literature. And so there was a great flowering of Jewish thought and culture during that time. And I was basically a product of that. Noam Chomsky is a classic example of somebody who was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and he just said, this is, this doesn't work. And he became a great advocate for, civil rights and Palestinian rights and so on. And many of the rebels against the Vietnam War, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, they were Jewish. You had Rosa Luxemburg, who was a socialist in Germany, Emma Goldman, who I think was an anarchist in the United States. Jake, I think was his name, Alex Berkman. He was a violent person. He attempted, I think he did commit murder, actually. So you've got that aspect of it, which I'm not advocating. But so you had on the one hand you've got these extremely conservative Jewish thinking, exemplified by Orthodox Judaism, which I think does have a very kind of insular attitude towards the rest of the world. You have the Jewish banking people like the Rothschilds and the Schiffs and and now, Wall Street is dominated. Maybe it's not completely dominated, but there's a huge presence of Jews on Wall Street who are, they're basically predatory capitalists. And on the other hand, you have people like Bernie Sanders, he's advocating socialism. So you've got a very diverse Jewish community. So it's a really mixed bag here. But in any case, let me just go back here to my notes. Excuse me. So after I went to California, I spent some time at the Zen Center, and I had spent some time at the Zen monastery, actually. And when I came back to Massachusetts, it was right after my mother's death, and my mother died in 1973. And so I came back from California to take care of that situation. And but I met my granduncle. He was the uncle of my father. My father had died in 1956, and so his uncle was my Uncle Reuben, who was a dentist by profession, but also a trained rabbi. And obviously a far more conservative or Orthodox Jew than I was really familiar with. My family didn't have much. They were nice people, but we didn't hang out with them. He and his wife, Aunt Bessie and Uncle Reuben, such good, nice Jewish names. So I told him that I was hanging out at this Zen monastery, and he said, "If you leave Judaism, you will experience spiritual annihilation." So this is the kind of mentality that I'm talking about, where it was really there was like an implicit threat that if you violated the group psychology and dared to go outside of that, what I would call a mental ghetto, you were like a bad person, essentially. So this is one of the a major issue that has been going on. I would say a controversy within the Jewish community, and even in Israel now. There's a huge gap between the very liberal Jews in Israel and the far more conservative ones. And the far more conservative ones want to have essentially a theocracy, and the other Jews, many of them don't even believe in God. But at the same time, they don't believe in God, but they think that God gave them the right to Palestine, or gave them the right to Israel, and the Palestinians are just in the way, and you need to get rid of them. So there's this kind of, double think mentality going on within even the liberal Jewish community, and there is a small peace-oriented component of the Jewish community in Israel that even did want to get along with the Palestinian population. And I'm going to post a couple of songs from that period, which show that there was a very strong socialist, revolutionary aspect of the Jewish community, and who did not want to antagonize the Palestinians, and then you had this, extremely, basically fascist wing of the Jewish, of the Zionist community. Probably the best exemplar of that is somebody named Jabotinsky, who was an admirer of Mussolini. And there are even documents that show that the Zionists were in collusion to a degree with the Nazis, because they were saying, yeah, it's okay for you to hate. It's actually good for you to hate Jews, because then Jews will be afraid and they'll be under us. So it was this fear-mongering. They were basically pandering to fascists in order to create this ghetto mentality. This is this is a losing proposition from my point of view. It's a neurotic, destructive point of view, but that's what it is, and that basically is the ideology that is dominant in the state of Israel at this point. So I'm going to talk about the Israeli genocide, because in Israel Shahak's book, he talks about the fact that in classical Judaism, there is a very strong element of extreme anti-Gentile thinking. And this is exemplified by Benjamin Netanyahu, who talked about the passage in the Bible where the Israelites, they come out of Egypt, where they've been slaves in Egypt, and then they come to the promised land. God, so the great realtor in the sky, said, yes, we told Abraham that this was going to be your land, and it's going to be from the Nile River to the Euphrates. And Israelis, a lot of them believe this stuff, and they're acting on it. It just this kind of mentality where the Jewish community in Israel they've internalized this idea of extreme victimhood, extreme nationalism, where this is our land and nobody else can have it, and this sense of victimhood where everybody hates us. Well, if you weren't so obnoxious, people wouldn't hate you. Why didn't you try and get along with people instead of harboring this idea of superiority and victimhood? These are like the twin pillars of internal. It's like the internal psychological oppression that the Jews impose on themselves. In my own case, I just thought, this is not. I am not interested in this. Interestingly enough, when I got to the Zen Center, a third of the people at the Zen Center were Jewish, and many of the early Buddhist Vipassana teachers. This is Southern Buddhism. It's a different branch of Buddhism, but it's very similar to Zen. They were, it was Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg and Jack Kornfield. They're all Jews, and Sharon Salzberg had this saying. In the first noble truth in Buddhism is this: four noble truths in Buddhism. Life is suffering. There's a cause. There's a way out, and there's a path to get you out of that. But the first one is life is suffering, and Sharon Salzberg says, we Jews know all about that. So I think following World War II, and there was basically an eruption within the Jewish community of my generation that said, this whole ghetto mentality, this is not working, and we're really not interested in that. And as a result, they completely, just said goodbye. And what Buddhism does, it says, you've got to face. It's like face your demons, and this is something that what Israel Shahak points out is that the attitude of the rabbinate in Judaism, in classical Judaism, is essentially totalitarian. So people have this internalized mental prison that they're in, actually, and they project that onto the outside world, which causes feedback and this, and so because they're so anxious about the other people, and they're on the one hand, God promised us, so we're superior to people, but people hate us, and you see this whole kind of neurotic mosaic of psychological patterns that are really very unhelpful. So in my opinion, so as I was saying, during the 1960s and 1970s, so in contrast to that extreme ghetto mentality that I've just been talking about, you had people like, as I mentioned, Abby Hoffman, and many of the people in the anti-war movement, many of the people who were in the civil rights movement were Jewish. So you got this kind of dual aspect of Judaism, of the Jewish community itself. So Howard Zinn is another great example of that. He was raised Jewish, and he wrote the book, The People's History of the United States. So, and he used the scholarship. It was like the scholarship that the Jewish community was trained in to study just the Bible and the Torah and the other Jewish writings, the Talmud. When they were freed from those constrictions, they were able to use that intellectual energy in ways that were very, very creative and helpful, in my opinion. So that's basically the issue. And so the question is, where do we go? Where does the Jewish community go from here? And I'll mention another one. Medea Benjamin is another Jewish person who's been very active in opposing Zionist oppression of Palestinians. So you've got this, and then on the other hand, you have these, Sheldon Adelson and his wife, and Chaim Sabin, who were both billionaires, and the Sabin, funds and corrupts the Democratic Party, and the Adelsons fund and corrupt the Republican Party, and Trump specifically. And so you've got this. It's a very very mixed bag, you could say, as far as the Jewish community is concerned. And from what I'm hearing, there are in the younger generation of Jews, I'm not talking about my generation, which from what I can gather, they're still, strongly Zionist. Although I think I do have relatives who are realizing, what's going on is, they know that something's really, really not good. So there is an awakening in the Jewish community that the whole nature of the Jewish state, is going to have to change. I don't know where this is going. As I mentioned, I have a cousin who is a member of it, like a Jewish Muslim friendship group, something like that. She's a little older than me. So you have these kind of shoots of wisdom and compassion and outreach towards other groups, and realizing that these kinds of artificial conflicts we need to overcome them now. And the reason why Israel Shahak wrote that book is because he was saying that in order to overcome this legacy of internalized oppression that the Jewish community experiences, in which they then project onto the outside world, he was saying Jews need to examine their own history and see that, well, maybe we're not all the good guys all the time. That there were aspects of the Jewish community that were frankly totalitarian, and this attitude of being anti-Gentile creates problems. So that's what I really wanted to talk about, and I hope that this has been kind of a rambling overview of this whole issue of Israel. I don't know where it's going, and to my mind, there's a really a self-destructive aspect of all this, and if and other commentators talking about this, the Israelis, they have an overly they overestimate their own capabilities, let's put it that way, and they're not only their own capabilities, but they really do think that God is on their side, and this kind of thinking is, in my opinion, really delusional and extremely dangerous. So if the Israelis decide to attack Iran, for example, Iran has the capability to wipe Israel off the map, essentially. In this 12-day war that occurred, the Iranian missiles knocked out a significant amount of Israel's infrastructure. And if they had knocked out the water purification plants, then there would have been no water. And what would Israel have done then? But the problem, of course, is that Israel has nuclear weapons, and it's backed by the United States, which is arguably, you want to talk about genocidal states. You got Israel is committing genocide, but they wouldn't be able to do it if it weren't for Trump and Biden both giving the bombs to Israel and supporting them in the United Nations against the rest of the world. So you've got it's a very it's a very toxic situation, and very difficult to untangle. So it's hard to say where it's all going. But if Israel is not careful, and they really do, it's one thing to take on Hezbollah in Lebanon, but it's another thing to take on Iran, which really does have the capability to do really, really serious damage to Israel. So that's the situation that it's in. And I went to a Zionist. It was not a Zionist. It was an Israeli. It was a yoga resort in 2022. It was run by Israeli expats, and we didn't really get into any kind of political discussions, except there was one woman there that I talked with who said that she's, of the 10% who's for peace with Palestinians. But most Israelis, they hate Palestinians. And there was one young woman who she had just finished her obligatory military service. And we talked a little bit about that, and she said, there's really no solution. And I'm thinking, I didn't say this to her, but there is a solution. It's a very, very simple solution. Just respect. Just respect. You came to this land, acknowledge the fact that people live there. They've been living there a lot longer than you were. You came from other countries. You went there, and just treat them with respect and say, we acknowledge your presence. We respect you as a people, and we need a place to stay because of terrible things to happen to us, but it's not your fault. We don't want to, cause suffering to you people. So, maybe we can build a country together that will be a great place to live for all of us. But it's going to take a major change in the mentality of the Zionist, community to make that happen. And I think the only way that it could possibly happen is it's not going to happen through an internal revolution. It's going to happen through a serious humbling of Israeli society, through some serious tragedy. When they've bombed Lebanon, they've bombed Syria. They destroyed Syria, basically. They've bombed Iran. They've killed numerous scientists and engineers, and Trump has killed military leaders in Iran. So there's a lot of really bad karma, we could say, that Israel is responsible for. And if there's any such thing as coming around and going around, Israel is going to have really high bill to pay, and we'll see what happens. If they're able to face that, then maybe it'll be okay. If they're not, then Israel may itself be completely wiped out, and it could go nuclear, because they do have nuclear weapons, and they do have this doctrine called the Samson option, where they're willing to bring down the whole world because of their own, distorted, toxic view of things. So that's the nature of it, and I don't really have a solution to this. It's just this this is the paradox that I see, and I thought it was worth bringing up. So thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Just please remember to please support my channel through a donation, or through a subscription, or through PayPal, or through Buy Me a Coffee, or through buying one of my t-shirts. Thanks again, and talk to you soon.